They were told it would take years. The Japanese naval commanders who had studied American industrial capacity in the 1930 seconds, who had pored over production figures and shipyard layouts and steel output statistics, had calculated with precision how long it would take the United States to replace what had been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. 18 months, perhaps 2 years, to rebuild a battleship fleet. 3 years to construct the carriers that would be needed to challenge Japanese dominance across the Pacific. They had seen the photographs of American shipyards, the traditional ways of construction, the careful craftsmanship that went into each warship. They had counted the slipways, measured the facilities, done the mathematics. But in the spring of 1943, Captain Tamichi Hara stood on the bridge of his destroyer and watched through his binoculars as the horizon filled with American ships, and his hands began to tremble. There were so many, far too many, and they were new. The intelligence reports that reached Tokyo that year carried a quality that Japanese naval officers had never before encountered in official documents: uncertainty bordering on disbelief. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and knew intimately what had been destroyed there, read the reconnaissance assessments with growing confusion. The numbers made no sense. American carriers were appearing in the Pacific at a rate that seemed to violate the basic principles of naval construction. Each fleet carrier should have required 3 years to build, perhaps 4. Yet here were reports of Essex-class carriers being commissioned every few months. At first, Fuchida assumed the reports were confusing different types of vessels, that the Americans were counting their small escort carriers alongside their fleet carriers to inflate the numbers. But the photographs proved otherwise. These were full-sized fleet carriers, each one capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft, each one a floating city of steel that should have taken years to construct. The photographs showed them at sea, operational, their decks crowded with fighter planes. Fuchida spread the images across his desk and tried to understand what kind of industrial system could produce such things with such speed. His mind, trained in the methodical traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy, could find no framework to contain what he was seeing. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto, began each morning by reviewing the intelligence summaries that documented American ship construction. He performed this ritual with a sense of dread that he confided only to his diary. In those private pages, he wrote that he felt as though he were watching a magic trick whose mechanism he could not comprehend. 1 month, the Americans would have 30 operational carriers. The next month, 40, then 50. The escort carriers were even more bewildering, small vessels built on merchant ship hulls, produced with such casual abundance that the Americans seemed to commission them the way other nations produced trucks. Ugaki had visited American factories before the war, had seen their automobile plants and steel mills, and had been impressed by their efficiency. But this was something different. This suggested not just efficiency, but a fundamental reimagining of how ships could be built. He wrote that it felt as though the Americans had discovered a secret that violated the natural order, as though they had found a way to bend time itself. The truth was even more extraordinary than the Japanese commanders suspected, and it rested on a single name that few of them had heard: Henry Kaiser. A construction magnate who had never built a ship before the war, Kaiser had looked at traditional shipbuilding methods with the eyes of an outsider and seen only inefficiency. Where traditional shipyards built ships from the keel up in a single location, Kaiser pioneered a system of prefabrication that treated a ship like an enormous assembly puzzle. In vast warehouses far from the water, workers built entire sections of ships, bow sections, stern sections, deck sections, complete with their wiring and piping and equipment already installed. These sections were then transported to the shipyard where massive cranes lowered them into place and welded them together. A Liberty ship, the workhorse cargo vessel that supplied the Allied war effort, traditionally took nearly a year to build. Kaiser's yards were producing them in an average of 42 days. In November 1942, to prove the capability of his system, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard constructed the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. The Japanese naval attaché in neutral countries tried to make sense of these reports. Surely there was some propaganda element, some exaggeration for morale purposes. No one could build a ship in 5 days. It was simply impossible. The steel alone would need weeks to be cut and shaped. The welding would take months. The engines and equipment would require careful installation and testing. Yet the photographs kept arriving, and they showed the same impossible truth. American shipyards were producing vessels at a rate that seemed to mock the very concept of maritime construction as the Japanese understood it. What the attachés could not see, what no amount of intelligence gathering could fully reveal, was the totality of the American industrial transformation. It was not simply that Americans were building ships faster. They had reorganized their entire economy around production in a way that Japan, with its limited resources and traditional craft systems, could never match. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, the sound was like thunder that never stopped. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of welding torches, the roar of cranes lifting massive steel sections. It continued 24 hours a day in shifts that kept the yards illuminated through the night. Women who had never worked outside their homes before the war now operated welding equipment, their faces hidden behind protective masks, their hands guiding torches that cut through steel plate. The workforce had swelled from a few thousand before Pearl Harbor to nearly 100,000 by 1943. Housing developments sprang up almost overnight to accommodate them. Childcare facilities were built beside the shipyards so that mothers could work. The entire system was designed around a single imperative: produce more ships faster. And it worked with a efficiency that stunned even the Americans themselves. Captain Hara, patrolling the waters off the Solomon Islands, found himself playing a grim mathematical game. He would sink an American destroyer, a difficult feat that required skill, luck, and often cost Japanese lives, and feel a brief moment of satisfaction. His ship had performed well. The crew had fought with courage. But then, weeks later, he would encounter 2 new American destroyers where the one had been sunk, then 3. The replacement rate seemed to accelerate with each passing month. For every Japanese ship that went down, there might be a year's wait for a replacement, if one came at all. Japanese shipyards were running at maximum capacity, but maximum capacity meant perhaps a dozen destroyers per year, a handful of cruisers, 1 or 2 capital ships if they were fortunate. The Americans were producing destroyers by the dozens, cruisers by the score, carriers that seemed to breed like fish. Hara began to feel that he was not fighting a war but trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The psychological impact of this industrial disparity rippled through the Japanese officer corps in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. These were men who had been raised in a culture that valued quality over quantity, craftsmanship over mass production. A Japanese sword took months to forge, with the swordsmith heating and folding the steel hundreds of times to achieve the perfect blade. This was seen as the superior approach, the patient creation of something excellent rather than the rapid production of something merely adequate. But here was a war where quantity had a quality all its own, where the Americans could afford to field adequate ships in such overwhelming numbers that Japanese excellence became irrelevant. A perfectly crafted Japanese cruiser, representing years of skilled labor and careful design, could be sunk by weapons from American ships that had been built in weeks. The traditional values that formed the foundation of Japanese military thinking were being rendered obsolete by industrial processes they could not match. Commander Toshikazu Omai, assigned to analyze American industrial capacity, produced reports that his superiors read with visible discomfort. He explained that the Americans were not simply building more of the same designs. They were learning from each production run, implementing improvements, creating standardized components that could be used across multiple ship classes. An American radio set might be installed in 10 different types of vessels, which meant they could be produced in enormous quantities and replaced easily. Japanese ships, by contrast, often had custom-designed equipment specific to each class, which meant limited production runs and difficult repairs. The Americans had also implemented quality control systems that caught defects early in production, reducing waste and delays. Omai's reports painted a picture of an industrial system that was not just larger than Japan's but fundamentally more sophisticated. His superiors thanked him for the reports and then seemed to wish they could unknow what they had learned. In the narrow waters between the islands where Japanese and American forces clashed throughout 1943 and 1944, Japanese sailors began to recognize American ship types with a familiarity that bred a kind of resigned exhaustion. There were the Essex-class carriers, each one nearly identical to the last, produced with such regularity that the Americans named them after battles and cities as though they were commemorating victories before they happened. There were the Gearing-class destroyers, modern vessels bristling with anti-aircraft guns, built at a rate of nearly one per week at their production peak. There were the Baltimore-class cruisers, powerful ships that arrived in groups like schools of predatory fish. And everywhere, like a swarm that could never be thinned, were the escort carriers and destroyer escorts, small vessels individually, but produced in such staggering numbers that they covered the Pacific like a net. A Japanese submarine captain might sink one escort carrier and consider it a successful patrol, only to learn that 3 more had been commissioned during the time he was at sea. The letters that Japanese officers wrote home during this period carried a subtle shift in tone that censors noticed but were instructed not to acknowledge. Early in the war, there had been confidence bordering on arrogance. Japan's victories had come so swiftly, so completely, that they seemed to validate every assumption about Japanese superiority. But by mid-1943, the letters spoke more carefully. Officers would assure their families that they were fighting bravely, that Japanese forces were maintaining discipline and honor, that the spirit of the warrior remained strong. What they rarely mentioned, what they perhaps could not find words to express, was the growing realization that bravery and discipline might not be enough. A pilot could be the most skilled aviator in the world, but if he was facing 10 enemy planes for every one of his, skill became secondary to mathematics. A ship captain could execute perfect tactics, but if the enemy could afford to lose 3 ships for every one they destroyed and still grow stronger, what did tactics matter? There were moments when the scale of American production revealed itself in ways that were almost comical if they had not been so terrifying. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese forces retreated, having lost 3 fleet carriers and hundreds of aircraft. American losses included some aircraft but no carriers. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that suggested the ease with which they had destroyed Japanese air power. But what haunted Japanese commanders was not just the defeat, but what came after. Within weeks, American carrier groups were operating at full strength again, their losses in aircraft already replaced, new pilots already trained and deployed. The American industrial and training pipeline was so robust that a devastating air battle barely caused a pause in operations. Japanese carriers, by contrast, would take months or years to replace if they could be replaced at all. Japanese pilots lost in battle represented years of training that could not be easily reproduced. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition that they had already won before the battles even began. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who would later command Japanese forces at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, spent long hours studying reconnaissance photographs of American naval formations. What struck him most was not the size of individual ships, but the composition of the fleets. American carrier task forces traveled with layered defenses that seemed excessive until you understood that the Americans could afford excess. A single American carrier might be escorted by 24 other vessels, destroyers for submarine defense, cruisers for surface action, additional carriers for mutual air support. The entire formation would be a floating fortress that could defend itself against almost any attack. Japanese carriers, precious and irreplaceable, often operated with minimal escorts because there simply were not enough ships to provide adequate screening. The Americans had so many ships that they could afford to dedicate dozens of vessels purely to defensive roles, knowing that their production capacity would continue to generate more. It was a luxury that Japanese commanders could barely imagine. The interrogation reports of captured American sailors added another dimension to Japanese understanding. The prisoners spoke casually about their ships, with none of the reverence that Japanese sailors brought to discussions of their vessels. American sailors would mention that their ship was new, built 6 months ago, and would speak of it the way one might discuss a new car, pleasant but not precious. They talked about the shipyards back home as vast industrial complexes where thousands of workers produced ships on assembly lines. They mentioned that their fathers or brothers worked in the yards, welding or riveting or installing equipment, making wages that seemed astronomical to Japanese interrogators. The Americans spoke of their industrial capacity the way Japanese might speak of the weather, as an omnipresent background fact of life that required no special comment. This casual assumption of abundance was perhaps more demoralizing than the ships themselves. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had understood the danger from the beginning. He had studied in America, had seen the automobile factories of Detroit, and had tried to warn his superiors that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. His famous statement that he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that he made no promises. This was not false modesty but mathematical certainty. Yamamoto had seen how Americans built things, the scale of their factories, the efficiency of their production systems. He knew that once the American industrial machine fully mobilized for war production, it would generate such overwhelming material superiority that Japanese skill and spirit would become irrelevant. When Yamamoto was killed in April 1943, shot down by American fighters who had intercepted his flight based on decoded communications, some of his staff officers wondered if he had been almost relieved to die before watching his predictions come fully true. The Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington produced 50 destroyers in under 2 years. The escort carrier program built 122 vessels between 1,942 and 1,945. The Liberty ship program produced 2,710 cargo vessels, each one capable of carrying 10,000 tons of supplies across the Pacific. The Victory ship program that followed produced faster, more capable cargo vessels at a rate of 1 every few days. The numbers became so large that they lost individual meaning and became instead a collective force, an industrial tide that simply could not be stopped. Japanese planners had initially believed that if they could destroy enough American ships in the first year of the war, they might secure a negotiated peace before American production reached its peak. But American production had no peak. It simply kept increasing, month after month, year after year, until the Pacific Ocean itself seemed too small to contain all the vessels the Americans had built. In the final months of the war, Japanese commanders faced a fleet that bore almost no resemblance to the one they had attacked at Pearl Harbor. The battleships they had sunk in 1941 had been obsolete even then, slow and vulnerable. The fleet that now approached Japan's home islands was built around fast carriers that operated in groups, supported by new battleships designed for carrier escort, protected by cruisers and destroyers equipped with radar fire control and proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. It was a fleet designed specifically for power projection across vast ocean distances, and it existed in such overwhelming numbers that Japanese resistance had become a mathematical impossibility. Officers who had spent their entire careers mastering the art of naval warfare found themselves facing an enemy who had solved the problem not through art but through industry, not through skill but through sheer overwhelming material abundance. The psychological surrender came long before the official one. By early 1945, every Japanese naval officer with access to intelligence reports understood that the war was lost, that it had perhaps been lost from the moment American shipyards began their impossible production runs. What they were fighting for now was not victory but something harder to define, honor perhaps, or the avoidance of shame, or simply because stopping would require an admission that was too painful to make. They continued to fight with courage and skill because that was what they had trained their entire lives to do. But the hope that had sustained them early in the war had transformed into something darker and more desperate. They fought knowing that each battle they won changed nothing, that for every American ship they sank, 3 more would appear, that the mathematics of industrial production had doomed them more surely than any military defeat. Captain Hara survived the war and wrote his memoirs afterward, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. He described the strange cognitive dissonance of fighting an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources, who could afford losses that would have crippled any other nation, who replaced ships faster than they could be sunk. He wrote about the moment he realized that skill and courage were not going to be enough, that Japan had entered a war against an industrial system that operated according to principles that Japanese tradition had never prepared them to understand. The Americans had not simply outfought them, they had outproduced them to such a degree that fighting became irrelevant. It was, Hara wrote, like discovering that the rules of warfare you had studied your entire life applied only to a game that no one was playing anymore. The shipyards that broke Japanese naval power were not dramatic in the way that battles are dramatic. There were no heroes charging into danger, no moments of individual valor that changed the course of history. There were instead tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, many of them new to industrial labor, showing up for shifts and welding steel and installing equipment with a efficiency that accumulated over time into something overwhelming. The drama was in the numbers themselves, in the impossible arithmetic of production that turned American factories into a strategic weapon more decisive than any battleship. The Japanese commanders who had calculated so carefully before the war, who had assumed that time and space and traditional production methods would protect them, found themselves confronting an opponent who had rewritten the rules of industrial possibility. In the end, it was not the quality of American ships that defeated Japan, though they were indeed well-designed vessels. It was not the courage of American sailors, though they fought with determination. It was the simple, terrible fact that America could build ships faster than they could be sunk, that American industrial capacity had become a force multiplier that rendered traditional military calculations meaningless. The Japanese naval officers who witnessed this transformation, who watched their carefully constructed strategy collapse under the weight of American production, experienced something beyond military defeat. They witnessed the obsolescence of their entire worldview, the revelation that the values they had been taught, patience, craftsmanship, quality over quantity, could be overwhelmed by a system that valued none of these things and won anyway. And there were thousands more stories like this waiting to be remembered.